My wife was in hell. I was certain of this. If it wasn't because she killed herself, then certainly because she took our 2 children with her. I hate her, of course. Some of that hatred is because of what she did to our kids. The rest is because she left me. I knew she was considering it. I saw her sidelong glances and that pensive, fearful look in her eyes. The guilt when she refused to meet my gaze. In those moments I chose to speak to her. She did not initiate conversation anymore. She had not for some time. I admit I lapsed in my own obligations in this regard, for I grew to prefer the silence. The house felt peaceful in those moments when I could listen to my own thoughts, uninterrupted save for the occasional interruption when she shushed our small children. They were good kids. They didn't cry much. They're in heaven now. I am also certain of this. They were too young to know evil when they died, and I believe that one's sins are of their own making. We do not inherit evil. Their mother could not drag them down into the pit with her, despite her efforts. I thought that I'd let her leave, when she finally came to it. It was a decision she took her time in making. There were signs that she was approaching the end, however. Money would vanish from my wallet. I began to track how much, not because I begrudged her the money. I did intend to let her leave after all, but because I wanted an approximation of when she collected enough to make the trip a couple states over, to where her parents lived. That seemed the logical place for her to go. But when she left, late at night when she thought I was asleep still, she took the children with her. I didn't realise, not until one of them made a noise and she shushed them as she always did, and I felt dread settle into my stomach. I wonder if I'd known in advance, somewhere in the back of my mind, what she planned to do. I regret my lack of clarity. My sense of unease was not enough to spur me to rash action, so I waited instead. Let her take them out into the garage. Let her take one of the cars. Let her leave. If I share any blame in what happened, it was this. I didn't stop her before she put them in the car. Only once the sound of the tyres and the engine dwindled did I leap out of bed, dress hurriedly, and run to the other car to follow her. I was going to let her leave. I was not going to let her take the children away. I don't want to linger on what happened. I had a suspicion of what route she'd take to leave town, and I drove so fast so that I could get her in eyeshot, just in case I was wrong. She drove slower than I expected, perhaps because part of her regretted her actions, and I caught up fast enough that she saw me before I could ease off on the speed, and then she accelerated until she reached an overpass, and then she turned the wheel and threw the car into the concrete sides of the bridge. No one survived. I think I lost myself a bit after that. My wife, gone. My children, gone. I felt empty inside. I felt robbed. Death had taken all that was mine, and I hated it, and slowly that hatred turned towards my wife. She'd left me, and she'd taken my children with her to a place where I could not go. Perhaps this was unkind of me, but what sane person wouldn't feel this way in the face of such a monstrous act? And I began to think, what if I were able to bring her back? What if I could see her again and ask why? Ask why she'd left, why she'd taken the children, why she'd killed them all. I wanted to yell at her again, and yes, it'd make her cry, but even that would be better than this terrible emptiness that my house had become. And then, maybe then, we could start over. She'd talk to me again, and I to her. My life was shattered, but maybe we could put it back together. I delved deep into the occult. There are stories of people who have gone to hell and back, and I reasoned that maybe there was some truth there. There is often truth in stories, after all. Besides, what had I to lose but time? And my time wasn't worth much these days. I won't bore you with the details of my research. Suffice to say, I found a method. I did certain acts and procured certain materials, and then on a certain night, at a certain time, I left my body behind and ventured out into the realm of the dead. I first stood upon a plain of sand and glass. I was naked, and the sand was hot beneath my bare feet. A constant dry wind blew, stirring up thick gusts of sand that bit at my exposed skin, and worked its grit into my mouth and nose. This was not the worst of it, however. The worst was the glass. It rose from the sand like obelisks. Thin, tall panes that shone like stars under a muted, grey sky. Their edges were jagged, sharp as knives. In the sand were more buried pieces, cracked and fallen from these obelisks. Some were almost as large as the obelisks themselves, protruding from the shifting drifts of sand. Others were smaller, the size of dinner plates or manhole covers. The smallest, though, the ones the size of my hand or my thumb, were the ones I quickly came to despise the most. These waited, hidden under the sand, to pierce an unwary foot, or they lay on top where the wind would pick them up and tumble them along the ground to slice an ankle that wasn't fast enough to evade. Or when the wind howled, when it came screaming through the glass, it would pick up these shards and mix them into the sand that blotted out the sky and hurl them at any creature unfortunate enough to find itself in the wind's path. My will was unshakable. My soul was strong. I walked through the field of glass, ignoring the pain, disregarding the bloody footprints I left behind. I walked until the world faded away behind me, and I returned to my body. The path to hell takes time. It is a progression, a gradual descent, until you find yourself at the gates of the abyss. I walked as far as I could that night, and then I woke, sprawled in my own bed, covered in a light dusting of sand. The sheets were soaked with blood from my lacerated skin. I stumbled into the shower, every movement agony, and I opened my mouth and screamed as the water streamed over countless open wounds and vanished down the drain in thin pink rivulets. My wife wouldn't have survived this. Were our positions reversed, I thought, as I sat, wrapped in a towel, and waiting for the last of the cuts to clot. She'd been a shy, fragile thing, but demanding of herself, honing her actions into perfection, like she was made of glass herself. I'm not sure which of the dichotomy first caught my notice. Perhaps it was both. Such a beautiful thing to be so delicate. I was there to catch her when her perfections faltered, and to put the pieces back together, and slowly she began to rely on me more and more as her friends fell away. As was natural, our lives were changing as college drew to a close, and when I asked her to marry me, it was the only obvious road left for us both. She said yes, and we had a large ceremony with all our friends, and she was pale and strained, and her smile faltered, until I squeezed her hands and we took our vows. It was the crowd. She'd wanted a small marriage, but there was family to consider, and I promised I'd be there for her whenever she balked at the size of the guest list. I'd fulfilled my vows. I'd been there for her, every time. Then, she left. That anger carried me beyond sleep that second night, down into the realm of the dead, and I found myself standing on the plain of sand and glass once again. The terrain had changed. If anything, it was more inhospitable. The panes of glass standing tall in thickets and clusters, their ends sharp like spears, waiting to impale the unwary. There was a dull hum in the background, just underneath the moaning of the wind. I paused for a moment to listen, and slowly it became clear that what I heard were voices, and then their words took form underneath my scrutiny. The field was littered with the souls of the damned. They were inside the panes of glass, inside the wind, buried under the sand, and here they voiced their anguish to a muted sky. The damned do not scream their obscenities. Heaven does not need to hear them, for heaven is all-knowing. Their cries and their curses are not meant for those lofty heights anyway. They whisper blasphemy, a quiet murmur that echoed in the corridors of my mind, an incessant drone, digging into my subconscious, working its way into the cracks and crannies of my thoughts. Their suspirations are not meant for heaven. They're meant for the mortals that still have time left to fall. I went to one of the obelisks. I stared into the glass, stared through it to the sand beyond. On the other side was an old man, a stranger I had never met before. I asked him the way to the gates of hell. He began to tremble, to shake, and told me to turn back. I repeated my question, and he began to rock back and forth, clutching at his head. "Ask another," he said. "Ask another of the damned. He would have no part in leading me to my doom." "I would have my answer," I screamed. I slammed a fist into the obelisk. The glass cracked under the blow. and the man wailed. He didn't deserve this, he said, and now here I was to torment him as well. What right did I have to judge him? Hadn't we both killed our wives? I smashed my fist against the glass again, felt it fracture against my skin. Blood seeped out and ran down the length of the obelisk. I did not kill her. The damned lie. That is why they descended into hell, and they would say anything to drag those not yet in the grave down with them. But the man began to laugh at my refutation, and I beat my fists against the glass in a rage until the pane was splintering, and cracks ran to all sides, and blood splattered against my face with each strike. I battered it until it broke, until it split in two and fell in pieces and chunks to the ground. Then, panting, I crouched and picked up the biggest shard and held it up. I stared through it to where the man lay in pieces, gnashing his teeth in anguish at his new torment that hell granted him. I took the shard with me. In time, he told me where I would go to find the gates, if only to persuade me to release him and let the sun bury him. I smashed it instead. His outstretched hands, pleading for mercy, and his screams are the last memories I have of that place before I woke. My hands were destroyed. The skin was flayed from the bone. I gasped, making mewling, helpless noises that sounded alien to my own ears. Trembling, I sat up and fumbled for my phone to call an ambulance. I was stronger than this. I had to be stronger. I'd always been the strong one in the relationship, the one that persevered through all hardships. That's why she left and I didn't. She was weak, despite all my efforts to save her from herself. The doctor at the ER stitched the flesh back onto my hands and swaddled them with gauze. I was given instructions to follow, told they would call me when it was time to get the stitches out, and then finally sent home. There wasn't much I could do that day, with my hands so damaged and my mind addled with pain medication. I sat on my sofa, and my thoughts kept meandering down pathways, trying to find where it all started to go wrong. Was it after the children were born? Or perhaps before? I can't recall. I know how it went wrong. She became distant to me. She was there, but she wasn't, and her responses were sullen when she gave them at all. I began to become sharper myself, as it seemed that was the only way to elicit a genuine response from her, and perhaps tears were better than that numb stare I'd grown accustomed to. She saw doctors. She didn't tell me about them, not until I came home one day unexpectedly, a surprise. I thought it might be nice to surprise her, and she wasn't there. I was waiting for her when she crept inside, and she admitted she was seeing a therapist. I thought this was fine. Perhaps she needed one, and she went for a few more times, but the therapist didn't actually fix anything, and finally I had to convince her to stop going and stop wasting our money. The kids needed her here, I said, not gallivanting off after her problems that would be resolved if she just started acting normal and maybe be a little stronger. Like me. I would help her. I did try. One more night. I had the way forwards. I knew how to escape the field of glass. Walk into the wind, the man had said. He'd walked his path before, after his flesh failed him, and his soul had been inexorably drawn forwards like a fish on a line until he stood at the gates and knew his fate was sealed. He was still alive, he'd said. There was still time left for me. It made me laugh. I was not the one that murdered our children, I said. My wife was the one that belonged in hell, not me. I did as the man instructed, after falling asleep in my bed and waking once more on the plain. I closed my eyes as tight as I could, and I walked forwards into the wind. It worked its way under my lids and past my eyelashes until tears flowed freely down my cheeks. I tasted blood in my mouth, from my chapped and broken lips, and there was grit between my teeth. I was walking blind, unable to open my eyes, navigating by the feel of the wind against my face alone. Eventually, I felt the plane of sand begin to curve downwards under my feet. The wind subsided. I opened my eyes, and there, at the bottom of the basin, was the gate to hell. It watched me with eyes the size of a dining table, and its open mouth could have swallowed a car. The rest of its head was covered in a thick mane, and where the neck should be were only two paws, claws extended. From between its teeth licked flames, and the back of its throat glowed like coals. I stood before it, and its breath carried the heat of the inferno to me. The lion's head asked why I'd come here, for my soul still belonged among the living. For my wife, I replied. I would like her back. The lion asked what made me so confident that hell had her, and smoke curled from its nostrils as it spoke. I told it how she'd taken my children and then dragged them into the grave with her. It asked why I wanted her back, if she'd done such a terrible thing. I wasn't ready for her to leave, I said simply, surprised to hear my own words. Was this it, then? My reason for coming here? It was like the words had been pulled from me. The lion considered. Then it closed its eyes and opened its mouth wide, the jaw descending, and its tongue unrolled from inside its head to lay across the teeth and form a bridge out onto the sand. From out of the fire and the heat came my wife. She looked small and lost when she appeared, her eyes glazed and distant. I reached out and took her by the hand and pulled her out of hell. I did this. I pulled her free. I took her from the lion's mouth and held her close to me, and she was cold and still to the touch. Were there terms? I asked this of the lion, scarce believing my look. No, the lion replied. There were none. It seemed pleased when it said this. There was a trick yet, I thought. I would have to be wary as we crossed the plane of glass together. So I turned, taking my wife under my arm, and I led her away. She did not talk, and I did not try to speak to her as we walked. There was hardly any ability to, for as soon as we crested the edge of the buzzin, the wind picked up. It caught up those thin slivers of glass, those splinters and knives, and whipped them at and around us. The gale shoved us backwards, losing one step for every two we took, and I dug my fingers into my wife's flesh in a desperate attempt to hold on to her. So this was the trial, I thought. Where Orpheus had to only look straight ahead, I had to fight and claw my way forwards, with my wife in tow. I tasted blood in my throat. I felt my skin part and sand turn into mud in my mouth. Still, I continued on, determined to succeed. I'd come so far. I would return to the world of the living, and I would bring my wife back with me. I needed to know why she'd left me. I needed to know she wouldn't leave again. These thoughts drove me along. I repeated it like a mantra, even as the damned screamed from the other side of the obelisks we passed, darkened by the sandstorm, like spires of obsidian. They called to me by name. Their cries became the wind, assaulting my senses, trying to drag me down into the sand and bury me alive, there in that field of sand and glass. I kept going, even as the glass sliced flesh from bone, and I felt myself disintegrating, muscles scoured to ribbons by the wind. My only thought was forwards, on and on, my fingers clutched around the shoulder of my silent wife beside me. I would drag her back. I would. This was my last thought as the world dissolved, and I descended into the dark, my mind filled with the roaring of the wind. My eyes stung like they'd been filled with salt when I woke. I rolled over, clutching at my face, and felt liquid coating the eye sockets and trickling down my cheeks. I wiped at them with the back of my hand, and it came away, smeared with blood. For long minutes I sat there, letting the tears flush the blood out until my vision cleared and I could see the room around me. Then, breathless, almost afraid of the answer, I rolled to look at the floor next to the bed. My wife lay there. She was on her back, breathing shallowly, her eyes open and fixed on the ceiling. She was shaking. I slipped off the mattress and got down onto the floor with her, gathered her up in my arms, and held her to my chest. I stroked her hair and told her it was going to be okay, that we were starting over again. This time it would be different, I said. I wouldn't let it go wrong. She wouldn't leave me this time. I'd make sure of it. Orpheus took his harp into the underworld and charmed its rulers into returning his wife. He beguiled them, and then his weak will failed him, and she slipped from his grasp. I marched into hell and clawed my way to the gates and claimed what was mine. This is why my wife is returned to me, why she lies beside me on our bed, and why she is here in the house when I return from work. She is pale and fragile, but she is mine, and I will protect her with these scarred hands. I wrenched her from hell, and I'll not let her slip away to fall back into the lion's teeth so easily. She barely speaks to me. I understand this. She died and was then brought back, and surely the horrors she endured in hell were far worse than my trials, enough to break anyone, much less someone as delicate as my wife. I see this in the emptiness of her eyes, of how she stares out of the window with a vacant expression, the brief glimpses of desperation when a facade falls, when she shifts from one emotion to another, and for a handful of seconds, I see her as she is. She's trying so hard. I keep telling her this, reminding her that things will go back to normal as long as she keeps trying. I remind her of what I did to her. I am her Orpheus, I said, one that did not fail her in the end. The worst is over, and now we can rebuild our lives together. This is the hope I give her when I see the fires of hell smouldering in her eyes, and her words are stuck in her throat, and she cannot abide my touch. I saved her. Cling to this, I tell her, and hold tight to it as a sign of my devotion. I succeeded where Orpheus failed. I braved the path to hell. I took what I wanted, and I returned. There is no other trial or obstacle that I cannot overcome, having passed through the fields of sand and glass. So then, why am I nervous when I find my wife staring at me with haunted eyes? Why, when she's in the kitchen, am I filled with an overwhelming need to go and take the kitchen knife from her hands? And why, when I see the fire in her eyes, do I think it is not the flames of hell, but hatred instead?